Hey biology students! This is our third lecture video on plants. I know, plants are exciting. No? You want to talk about animals instead? Next week. Next week, animals. A sneak preview on animals, though. Let me introduce you to the rare, the endangered, just kidding, domestic cat. Hunter. This is my domestic cat, Hunter. He likes to spend time learning about biology lately. This is where I come to record my lectures to my only audience, Hunter the cat. Oh yeah, and there's you too. Thanks for watching. Lecture video number 3, Gymnosperms. Okay, here's a Google for you. Type into Google, oldest living thing on Earth. Oldest living thing on Earth. Type it into Google. I'll wait. What'd you get? Oh, it's what's on the slide. Wow. Who's this? This is the Great Basin Bristlecone pine, the oldest living thing on Earth. Let's write that down here. It's the Great Basin Bristlecone pine. How old is it? Whoops, bristlecone pine. Okay, so it's an example of a type of plant. We call it Gymnosperm. And the oldest living bristlecone pine is approximated to be about 5,000, a little bit more, but about 5,000 years old. Wow, so that tree was around in 3000 BC. That's around the time that early humans were building Stonehenge. Wow, that is an old tree. They've been around a long time, seen a lot of things. Wouldn't it be interesting if trees could talk? Okay, so back to this diagram. We talk about this diagram in every video, don't we? So I'd like to add something to this diagram now. You're ready. So I'm going to add something to this diagram. Actually, I'm going to add a couple somethings to this diagram, and I'm going to hope it doesn't scare you too much. Now you're ready for it. If you've watched the other videos in order, you're ready. You can do this. You know this story. This is the alternation of generations. This is the life cycle of all plants, right? All plants. So gymnosperms certainly do this life cycle. What's different though? Gymnosperms, as well as angiosperms, make seeds. So where do the seeds show up in the diagram? Here. So after fertilization produces a zygote, that zygote, of course, is the new sporophyte. Well, the zygote will be protected in a seed. Okay, it's no longer just going to be embedded in the female gametophyte like we saw with the ferns and with the mosses, where it's protected inside of the female and relies on the female gametophyte. No, it's going to be dispersed into nature, okay, in various ways. So the seed protects, purpose of the seed, it protects the embryo. Okay, so let's start with that. Let's talk a little bit about seeds. So seeds are produced by both gymnosperm plants and angiosperm plants. So I know we haven't done the angiosperm lecture yet. That'll be the next video. But as a little sneak preview, both of these groups produce seeds. Okay, so gymnosperms, this word actually means naked seed. The reason is that the seed is not protected inside of the fruit, which is what happens in angiosperms. So in angiosperms, the seed is protected. Angiosperm means vessel seed. It means that the seed is inside of a fruit. And that is unique to angiosperms. Gymnosperms do not produce fruit and do not produce flowers either, okay? But they do protect the embryo inside of a seed. So the general structure of a seed, there are three components. So first of all, because the job of a seed is to protect the embryo, it has a hard outer shell. We call that hard outer shell the seed coat. And the seed coat is derived from sporophyte tissue, so the seed coat is diploid. Inside of the seed, there is a whole bunch of protein material that's highly nutritious, and we call this part, the internal part of the seed, we call it the endosperm. And the purpose of endosperm is to feed the embryo. It provides the nutrition for the embryo. This is also why eating seeds, certain types of seeds, is highly nutritious. There's a lot of protein in seeds, things like sunflower seeds, for example, nuts. So provides a lot of nutrients. Some seeds you want to make sure you remove the coating though, because that seed coating sometimes has some chemicals in it that aren't very good to consume, at least in high quantities. Like apple seeds, the seed coating of apple seeds is actually a compound that contains cyanide, which can be very poisonous. So you don't want to consume too many of those. Okay, and then inside of in here, we're going to find the young sporophyte or the embryo. And the embryo is diploid. And the endosperm and gymnosperm, so if this was a gymnosperm seed, then the endosperm would be haploid. And that's different in angiosperms, so we'll talk about that when we get to it, but that's how that works. Now, let's go ahead and color code this. So seed coating, diploid. Endosperm, haploid, It's all this here. Young sporophyte, let's do green. So in other words, there's a baby plant inside of the seed. Fertilization has already occurred to create this seed. Okay, going back to this diagram again, our general alternation of generations for plants. So I would like to add some more details to this. Let's add a little bit more detail, okay? So now I would like to tell you that gymnosperms and angiosperms make two different types of spores. We call them microspores and megaspores. Microspores become the male gametophyte. Okay, so they grow into the male gametophyte. And the megaspores grow into the female gametophyte. These structures are very separate in the gymnosperm plants and the angiosperm plants, rather than being as connected to the sporophyte. And we have a special word for male gametophyte. We call it pollen. Okay, so the male gametophyte is the pollen. So that is the second major adaptation of the gymnosperms and the angiosperms would be pollen. So pollen and seeds. Okay, so now let's describe who the gymnosperms are, and then we'll go and talk more about their life cycle in detail. Okay, so gymnosperms, they do not have fruits or flowers, but they do make pollen. And once again, pollen is the male gametophyte. They make seeds. This is their big adaptation. This is the first plants to make seeds. The function of seeds: protect the embryo, feed the embryo. Sporophyte dominant. Wind or animals can aid in the seed dispersal process. Oops. Let's talk about the groups. So what does it mean to be a gymnosperm? Well, gymnosperms are conifers, and conifers include pine trees, spruce trees, cedar, fir trees, redwoods, and a few others, but that's a good enough list there. Number 2, in this picture, these are called cycads. This picture, these guys are called netophytes. And up here, ginkgo. The ginkgo tree, which is used in Chinese medicine as an herbal supplement that's supposed to improve memory. So our classic example of a gymnosperm we're going to study here is a pine tree. So when you look at a pine tree, and if you celebrate Christmas and you get a Christmas tree at holiday time, let me give you another way you can describe a Christmas tree. So when you see a Christmas tree, a giant pine tree, guess what you're looking at? The sporophyte. So you can really impress your family next time you go and get your Christmas tree around holiday time, and you can say, we are chopping down the sporophyte of the plant. It is the dominant structure. It is the largest structure. Did you know there's 2 types of pine cones? So most people know the female pine cones. The female pine cones are the traditional pine cones that you see around. They fall to the ground. They're used for decoration, again, during holiday time. But this is the female pine cone. So the female cones are called ovulate cones. And the female cones are much bigger relative to the male cones. These are the male cones. Have you ever seen the male cones? They're much smaller, usually just a couple inches long, maybe even smaller. And you see them at the bottom of, usually they've been dropped out of the pine trees, and you see them along the bottom of the tree. So the male cones are referred to as, well, they go by a couple different names, but let's call them pollen cones. So the pollen cones are smaller, and you guessed it, they make the pollen. So the female cones are really part of the mature female sporophyte. And the mature female sporophyte will make spores, right? So it's going to make the megaspores. And the male cone, which is really the mature male sporophyte, will produce the microspores. Okay, let's continue this story on the next slide. Here, we're going to put together the whole life cycle of the gymnosperm. Yes, it is a little more complicated than the other life cycles we've seen so far, the moss and the fern. So just hang in there. Remember, you can always pause the video, you can always rewind, and take as much time as you need to walk through the steps. That's one advantage of distance learning, isn't it? Okay, so you have this entire picture in your PowerPoints that I provided for you with the blank labels. I highly recommend you fill in the labels with me in the video and pause where you need to pause. I am going to take it one step at a time. So we just talked about how the giant pine tree, the physical pine tree you can see without a microscope, is called the sporophyte. And the sporophyte has 2 very important cones that are also part of the sporophyte, but we would consider the female mature sporophyte the female cone, or what we call the ovulate cone, and the male cone, the pollen cone. So both of these are part of the sporophyte, so they would be considered diploid. Now what are we going to do? Well, see that we're zooming in using a microscope to see the gametophytes. That's because the gametophyte structure is very reduced in the gymnosperm. Very hard to see. In fact, impossible to see without a microscope. So now we're going to go microscopic to see the gametophytes. And we're not even quite there yet, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to be zooming in on little structures of the cone that we call scales. So when you've seen let's go back here. So when you've seen pine cones, do you notice that it's composed of all of these little rigid, so in female cones, the female cones are very rigid. And these little structures here that open up, we call this a scale, and it's very rigid. It's considered a modified leaf. It's sort of like that. Okay. Now male cones also have the scale, so they have these little units we call scales. But it's actually a soft leaf, so it's not rigid like the female cones, and it's much smaller. Okay, so they're composed of these little units called scales. Now you can see a scale without a microscope, but you really need to zoom in on it to see that each scale shown here is producing the spores. So remember, pine cones produce the spores, and there's two types of spores that are produced. There's megaspores on the female cones, and there's microspores on the male cones. Let's talk about the male cones first, the pollen cones. Okay, so what's going to happen here is that we are going to undergo meiosis in the scale, the microscopic scale of the pollen cone, and it's going to produce these little spores here, but we're going to label them microspores. Okay, so the microspores are produced by meiosis, and then the microspores undergo mitosis, and they produce this funny little structure here, all microscopic. Okay, we're going microscopic here. All of these pictures here, all microscopic. And what is this? This is pollen. Okay, so pollen is the male gametophyte. Because remember, the spores grow into the gametophyte structures. So now we're saying each microspore will grow or divide by mitosis to produce pollen. And what's inside the pollen? Sperm. There's actually two. So there's sperm inside of the pollen, and then the pollen actually has what we call wings. They look like little ears on both sides. Now you need a microscope to see pollen, to see it up close, to see the individual, components of it. But in gymnosperms, the pollen looks sort of like Mickey Mouse, okay, with the ears. But these aren't called ears, by the way. These are called wings. And that's because the primary way that the pollen is dispersed is by wind. So it's mostly wind dispersal. Okay, so the pollen will move, and then inside this part here we would have the sperm. Okay, microspores would be haploid, pollen would be haploid, sperm would be haploid. Okay, so that's from the pollen cone. From the ovulate cone, the female cone, which is part of the mature female sporophyte, where there are these scales. Now, when the female cone is immature before fertilization, it is closed. All of the scales are very tightly closed, and it's much smaller and is oftentimes green in appearance. So what's happening on those scales? So here on the female cone, meiosis occurs to produce megaspores. Those megaspores undergo mitosis. Now, one of the things you're going to notice is that there are 4 megaspores shown in this picture. And what happens is actually 3 of them die. 3 of them die off. So there's only 1 megaspore that remains. And then it's that 1 megaspore that divides by mitosis to make these 2 cells here. Okay? Now this here would be considered the ovule sac. And the ovule sac is considered the female gametophyte. Really, it's what's happening inside here. These are the little sacs. Now what's inside here? Eggs. Okay, so the egg cells are inside. Once again, let's add our haploid megaspores, haploid ovule sac, which is the female gametophyte, and haploid egg cells. Now the egg cells are retained in the female cone on the scale. What happens is that the pollen travels by wind, and this allows for pollen to come from other pine trees. So to create some genetic diversity here for the pine. So this process here we would call pollination. And so pollination is mostly by wind, occasionally by insects, but mostly wind. And so it travels by wind. And then what happens is then the pollen lands on the female cones. And when the pollen lands, it produces what's called a pollen tube. So this is a pollen tube. And the purpose of the pollen tube is to deliver the sperm. And it delivers those 2 sperm that we talked about. So it delivers those 2 sperm via the pollen tube to the ovule sacs in here and delivers the sperm nuclei. Now we have fertilization. And fertilization will produce a zygote that is diploid. Okay, so within each scale, there is the potential for there to be 2 eggs fertilized and 2 seeds made. This process is very lengthy in the pine. This process takes about 15 months for this whole process to eventually produce a seed on each scale. So we're seeing 2 seeds per scale of the female cone. And so those seeds eventually get dropped out of the female cone. So eventually she'll open up her cone, and then that's when the female cones have their open scales. And that's typically the types of pine cones that you're familiar with, and the ones that drop to the ground. So the ones that drop to the ground, the reason why they're on the ground is that they've already released their seeds. And the seeds that come out, they are called helicopter seeds because they spin around when they come out of the female cones. And so we say that when that seed lands, it could primarily is going to be dispersed by wind, so it's going to travel by wind, occasionally by animals, okay, but by wind primarily, and then is going to germinate when it lands somewhere else, somewhere new, into the new tree. Let's take a look here of what that seed looks like up close. So once again, these are the scales where we have the seeds, 2 seeds forming per scale, and the seed part is here, and then it has a single wing that it uses for travel. Okay, so that is the pine life cycle, and I hope that was helpful.